I think it's time to start. Welcome everyone to this very special event. This is the first in a series of events devoted to the Russian aggression on Ukraine and its consequences for Europe. My name is Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies and professor of government at Harvard. Now, I would like to thank co-sponsors of this event, which are the Europe in the World Seminar, Davis Center for Russian and Euro-Asian Studies, and Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. I would also like to thank the center's staff for their hard work on this event. Especially, I would like to thank Kerry, Kale, and Michael. We have a great panel today, and the panelists will offer some perspectives coming from very different parts of Europe and different parts of the world. Since we have a very limited time, I'm not going to provide extensive introduction of our speakers. But I will just briefly mention a couple of things about them. Now, Mary Sarotte is a Kravis chair at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. She is also research associate of the Center for European Studies and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mary is a historian of modern Europe and Cold War, and her highly acclaimed books shaped our understanding of the end of the Cold War. Those books were named by the Economist and Financial Times Books of the Year. Mary earned her academic degrees from Harvard and from Yale University. Our next panelist is Sigmar Gabriel, who is the chairman of the Atlantik-Brücke. He's one of the most accomplished and influential European politicians. He held several leading posts in the German government, most recently as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, 2017-2018, and Vice Chancellor of Germany, 2013 to 2018. Prior to that, he was Germany's Minister of Economic Affairs and Energy and Federal Minister of Environment. Gabriel was one of the longest serving leaders of the Social Democratic Party, being the leader from 2009 to 2017. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies. Dimitris Keridis is a professor of international politics at Panteion University in Athens, and he's one of the most influential public intellectuals and a regular TV political commentator in Greece. Since 2019, he is the member of the Hellenic Parliament. He is also a senior fellow at the Karamanlis Foundation and has been directing various programs on international relations in Greece, including Navarino Network, which is the public policy think tank based in Thessaloniki. Dimitris was our colleague here at Harvard, serving as the director of Kokalis program at the Kennedy School of Government. He also was the professor, Karamanlis professor at Fletcher School of Diplomacy. What we are going to do today, I ask our panelists to start with a very short few minutes comments, and then I will moderate the discussion. We also hope to accept some questions from the audience. Now, I will group those questions in order to make our discussion more flexible. Now, the chats will not be open, so if you have a question, please pose this question through Q&A channel. We have a huge audience today, more than 400 people, so if you want to really ask the question, probably doing this sooner rather than later is a good idea. So now let me turn to Mary Sarotte for the introductory remarks. Mary, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, it's good to be with you, even though the cause is obviously a very sad one. And I have to start by expressing my admiration for the bravery of the Ukrainians resisting the aggression from Russia. It is truly remarkable. And I am really in awe of the way they are resisting this terrible aggression. I'm also heartbroken by the title of our event today, Europe at War. My background, as many of you may know, is as a historian of the Cold War. And I am used to looking at images of war in Europe, but they are historical images. So it has been a surreal experience for me to see the kind of images, and not just for me, but for everyone, to see these images and realize they are not historical, but current. The experience has also been particularly strange for me since, as you're kind enough to mention, I've written a number of histories of the Cold War and post-Cold War period. And the most recent one of those is called Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has, of course, been using that phrase, not 1 inch, repeatedly in press conferences to justify brutalizing Ukraine. That, of course, in no way justifies brutalizing Ukraine. He's instrumentalizing history for his own purposes. But it has meant that there is now a renewed focus in both Washington and in Europe on the history of the post-Cold War period, on the history of NATO enlargement, on the history of the fight between Washington and Moscow over NATO enlargement, and in particular over this controversy that gave rise to the title of my book, the Not 1 Inch Controversy. So it has been a very, very strange and surreal time for me as well, obviously not nearly as strange and surreal as for the Ukrainians. And I think what is happening now is a combination of Putin's accumulated historic grievances, both about the way that, in his belief, Russians and Ukrainians belong in the same state. He does not think Ukraine deserves to be a separate state or nation. Obviously, the Ukrainians feel very differently. So there's his historical grievances about Ukraine, but then there are also his historical grievances about the way that the post-Cold War European security order turned out to be so disadvantageous to Russia, and in particular about how far NATO enlarged. So there's this mixture of these historical grievances and then his willingness to use brutality currently. I think it's important to remember that Putin's grievances come not just out of living history, but out of lived history. He was, of course, as many of you may know, a junior KGB officer in the East German city of Dresden in 1989. He witnessed the collapse of Soviet power in East Germany firsthand. He was horrified by it. He wanted to use violence to resist it. He wanted to shoot peaceful protesters who came to the KGB outpost in Dresden. And he called for military backup from Soviet troops in East Germany. And the person who answered the phone refused to provide Putin with that backup, saying, "I will not authorize the use of force without explicit authorization from Moscow, and Moscow is silent." And Putin has long repeated that that phrase, "Moscow is silent," has haunted him, that he feels the Soviet Union should have pushed back violently and retained its position in Central and Eastern Europe. And clearly Moscow is not silent today. So there's a lot of history involved in the events of today. Before this event, you asked me to talk briefly about the mood in Washington, where I work at the Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. If there is any good to come out of this terrible tragedy, it is the fact that Western cohesion is now much stronger than it was a month ago. Even countries such as Poland and Hungary, where there have been deep disputes over de-democratization in those countries, even those countries have been working closely together with NATO allies. Poland in particular has been extraordinarily welcoming, as you know, Grzegorz, to refugees. I just saw in the Financial Times today that Poland has now the second biggest refugee population of any country in the world. And President Biden is, of course, going to Poland on Friday. So that is a dramatic improvement in relations between Poland and its NATO partners. So I think the sense of cohesion and unity, both within NATO and within the sanction regime, is something to be welcomed. As I said, one of the few positive signs. There are also signs that may even help with the American domestic divide, because while it's not complete, obviously there are outliers like Tucker Carlson, there is widespread agreement that what is happening is horrific and is wrong. So from the point of view of Washington, there are some positive effects. The big question now, and I'll end on this, is how to support the Ukrainians without escalating to nuclear war. I wrote a New York Times op-ed on this a couple of weeks ago. That is the challenge. On the one hand, we need to remember what many of us learned, many of us who remember the Cold War learned, that we must avoid escalation to thermonuclear conflict, because that would be civilization ending. Even though it's been 30 years since what we must now call the old Cold War, Washington and Moscow still control more than 90% of the nuclear warheads on the planet. They are the only two countries in that category. They're the only two countries that can devastate life on Earth and end civilization. During the Cold War, we had a popular awareness of what that means, but I fear that popular awareness is lost. So we must always keep that in mind. I think there's not really a sufficient popular understanding of just how dangerous things have gotten, how quickly in the past month. But on the other hand, what is happening in Ukraine is utterly abhorrent and utterly unacceptable. And so we need to find ways to help the Ukrainians below that threshold of escalation to thermonuclear war. Now, that is a big challenge, but the good news is that the United States and the West has done this before. It was called the Cold War, and we had 40 years of experience in pushing back against the Soviet Union without escalating to thermonuclear war. So we are going to need all of those skills again. We're going to need European studies, and we're going to need nuclear strategy and the history of the Cold War era. And so I'm very grateful to CES for supporting all of those things and having this series at this critical moment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mary. Germany is perhaps next to the US the most important country in trying to discourage Russia from brutality and from this invasion. So let me give floor to Sigmar or Gabriel at this point.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this debate, although it's actually terrible that we are talking about a war in Europe. And I think, of course, it's unbearable for every observer that we have to largely stand by and watch the people in Ukraine die, because we did not found the answer to the question of what we just heard, what to do and not to enter the danger of a nuclear war. You asked me, Germany was important to do something, not to bring Russia to this terrible war, but we failed. And maybe that's the difference to the old Cold War. And maybe this is the starting point of our misunderstanding during the last years. We always thought that Russia is more or less equal to the former Soviet Union. And I think this is a big misunderstanding, and was a big misunderstanding, because the Soviet Union was a status quo power. And it's not so difficult to negotiate with a status quo power. Russia is a revisionist power, and we had the chance to see this when they acted in Georgia or in Aleppo and in other parts, or 2014 in Crimea. But we always thought, especially when it comes to our energy dependency on Russia, our experience out of the Cold War is that the Soviet Union, they delivered as and oil. They were predictable, even in the darkest times of the Cold War. And this is not the case any longer. I think, looking a bit on a broader picture, that we are only at the beginning of a global struggle and fight about what the new world order will look like after the end of the Pax Americana. Ahead of us probably is a decade of global insecurity, a decade of peacelessness. This does not mean that a real kinetic war break out again and again, as it currently is the case in Ukraine, but trade conflicts, sanctions, cyber attacks, misinformation, and military violence will characterize the coming years. And for the first time, and that's also the difference to the first Cold War in the 20th century, it's done in Europe and not in other parts of the world. The conflict is not a Western confrontation with Russia or a US-led democracy fight against Russia. Rather, it is a conflict over a rule-based order in which nations guarantee each other's territorial integrity, regardless of their social or political orientation. Russia has broken this minimum standards of the international order. If that catches on, other examples will follow. I think it's important to say this again and again, because there are some parts of the world who would be not interested in this conflict if it's perceived as a conflict between the West and Russia. Then there are others who would say, okay, two imperialist powers are fighting with each other. What does this have to do with us? It's an international conflict about minimum standards in the global order. And that's the reason I was very happy to see that more than 140 nations in the UN General Assembly voted against Russia, which was astonishing. And only Syria, Eritrea, and I think Belarus were on the side of Russia. I think, of course, Russia can defeat Ukraine militarily, but it has already lost politically and economically. I think Russia has become the outlaw of world politics. It's not North Korea, yes. Its economic potential and its military power is strong enough to find economic cooperation partners in developing countries or countries like China. But however the outcome of this war will be, Russia will be a shadow of itself at the end. This makes the situation not easier, maybe more dangerous, because I think Vladimir Putin is a guy who recognized this weakness of Russia. He saw that he had a miscalculation how fast he could win in Ukraine. He saw that all his ideas about the end of Western democracies, that this did not happen. We are stronger than decades ago. A year ago, we debated in Europe about the brain dead of NATO. We had an American president who questioned the membership of NATO. Today, we have a very strong alliance in Europe and together with the United States. So Putin sees that all his calculations went wrong. And my fear is that this will bring him to more, to even more dangerous events, to test this unity of the West. And therefore, I very much appreciate that the United States president is coming to Europe and to debate with allies how we can stay united. And of course, there are differences about what we should do to support Ukraine between, for example, the east part of the European Union and the western part. And the biggest danger today, I would say, is that tests through Putin and his guys in Moscow would bring us to frictions and to internal debates in the Western Alliance and the European Alliance. This is the biggest danger in these days. And I hope that the visit of the United States president will strengthen the alliance in Europe and together with the United States. At the end, I don't think that we are close to something like a ceasefire or end of war. Unfortunately, I hope that I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but I can't see any reason why Putin should stop at this point his war. I think we will see more blood. I think he will try to get Kiev and to bring the government out of Kiev. And then possibly he would say, okay, I reached my targets. We had the so-called denazification and the genocide, so-called genocide against Russians are stopped. And then maybe he is willing to negotiate with the US or maybe also with China. But until now and during the next weeks and months, I can't see any reason why he should stop his aggression against the neighboring country. And this is a bitter truth for the Ukrainians who really fight in a brave way where I would not be sure of every West European country would do it in the same way. But because we are all afraid about entering a nuclear confrontation with Russia, I can't see that by military means we could stop Russia going further in Ukraine. So the only chance we have is really to sanctionize, to weaponize the dollar and the euro against Russia, and of course to deliver financial support and military support to the Ukrainians. That's the state of play, how I see it.
Okay, great, thank you. Dimitris, how the situation looks from your vantage point in Southern Europe?
Very bad, I have to say. First of all, allow me to thank you for this very kind and honoring invitation to be in such a panel with so many prestigious co-panelists. Mr. Gabriel has many friends in Greece from his time in power, and I was just speaking with an old professor of mine, Mr. Venizelos, who sends his regard. He was vice prime minister in Greece in the recent past, and yes, and of course we have all read the books of Professor Sarotte and your own, Grzegorz. So thank you very much. Now it seems to me, it seems to us to confirm what has just been said. And I have been listening in Washington, where I was recently within a Greek delegation meeting with senators and congressmen and people from the State Department and the defense, that we are all trapped in Putin's big mistake and big miscalculation. He has failed politically for sure, no matter what the outcome of the military confrontation is. But it seems to me that even militarily, he is faced with unexpected difficulties. The heroic Ukrainian resistance has turned this into a much more protracted conflict, a war of attrition, than it was initially planned. And the fear is that Mr. Putin, being Mr. Putin, will try to use some dramatic gesture to break the impasse and to break the resistance and the morale of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. And so there is increased talk about the use of non-conventional, mainly chemical weapons, which will be a further unprecedented escalation in this conflict. So the talk, both in Washington, in Brussels, in Athens, obviously, is how to find a way out of this paranoia that has engulfed the Kremlin, and how to offer a path to de-escalate to Putin. But obviously we have not been able to find such a path so far, and here we are. I'm afraid that we are only the beginning of what's going to be a big tragedy. Even if we avoid escalation and the involvement of neighboring countries, which is a big if, given the pressures already produced, the humanitarian crisis, the refugee crisis, and the unpredictability of Mr. Putin, I think we are dealing with a devastated Ukraine and a destabilized and surely impoverished Russia, with whatever this entails for global stability, peace, and security. Russia is not North Korea. It's not a marginal player. It's a basic pillar of the international system. It's the biggest country on earth. It is the biggest nuclear superpower. It has more nuclear warheads than any other nation, more even than the United States. It is a permanent member of the United Nations, and it can paralyze the UN, as it has already done. Now, I am in the Council of Europe, Parliamentary Assembly representing Greece. We have recently decided to expel Russia from the Council. The only countries that voted did not vote for that out of 47 was Serbia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the only NATO country, Turkey. And I think it's indicative of the broad consensus in Europe there were 42 out of 47, a huge majority against Russia. Now, as far as Greece is concerned, obviously I come from a country that until recently felt very close to Russia for historical and cultural and religious reasons. There has been a large Greek community in Russia and in the Black Sea. My father was born in the Russian Black Sea himself, and I still remember my grandparents talking Russian at home. And many, many others, especially people who came after the disintegration of the Soviet Union in the 90s to Greece. And obviously, historically, Russia was a counterweight to Turkey. As you probably know, there are famous Russia-Turkish wars from the time of Peter the Great all the way to the First World War. And there is the Orthodox religion, and there is the economics, and there is the energy. So there have been a lot of connections, so much so that in a 2017 opinion poll, Vladimir Putin came first in Greece as the most popular world leader, much more than all Greek leaders, with 75% popularity. That was in 2017. I'm saying this to tell you that if Greece has turned so much against the Russian regime and the Russian government's decision and Vladimir Putin, you can see the sea change in views in Europe vis-a-vis Russia. Now the popularity of Putin is around 20%, still high, but nothing compared to the astronomical 75% only 5 years ago. This is because the Greek government and the main political parties, I have to admit, have taken a very strict and clear position against the Russian invasion. From the very first moment, the Greek Prime Minister was adamant for both principle and self-interest reasons. Greece is a country that has come into modern existence through a revolution, a liberal democratic revolution against an empire, and has always sided on the, let me allow what we say here in Greece, the correct side of history, both in the two world wars and the Cold War. And it has continued to exercise a foreign policy based on law, respect for human rights, integrity of states and sovereignty and so on and so forth, but also self-interest, because we don't want revisionism, we don't want revanchism, we don't want the forceful change of borders. We already have a big problem with the Turkish threat to our east, and we don't want this to be validated through a successful Russian campaign with the West doing nothing. So we are encouraged by the unity, as our professor has just mentioned, and the cohesion of the Western alliance that would not have been, should not be taken for granted. Allow me just to say that if Donald Trump had been re-elected in 2020, I doubt that United States would be in NATO today to be able for the US president to come to Brussels in an emergency summit and reconfirm that unity. The things had got perilously close to having the United States abandon the transatlantic alliance, with everything that this might have entailed for the stability and security of Europe. And we are particularly encouraged by the German decision for rearmament. that signifies a broader geostrategic emancipation of Europe. I want to underline the fact that this was a decision taken by a center-left government, by a SPD Chancellor, with broad political support from all main parties in Germany. So it has a bipartisan, long-term, strategic backing behind it. And of course, there is Finland and Sweden, and even Switzerland, for the first time after 2 centuries, has chosen sides, which speaks volumes about where we are. This is the one good positive thing coming out of this very, very dark moment. Russia is trying to counteract. It has used the Russian party, quote unquote, inside Europe to try to destabilize governments here in Greece with various agents, the internet, the media, even friendly political formations, let me put it this way. We have seen a reaction when it comes to the church. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople is a primary victim of that Russian attack, because they were the ones who recognized the autocephaly of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church back in 2019, which was a big offense to the Patriarchate of Moscow's prerogatives over Ukrainian Orthodox population. We see a big competition with Moscow in Africa between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Patriarchate of Alexandria or the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. It's a fascinating and very interesting and underreported competition for influence, which brings the Greeks at the forefront of the struggle to counteract Russia's penetration and influence in these parts of the world. And obviously, there is economic pressure with energy. Tourism has ceased from Russia. It was a big part of Greek revenues. And people are very anxious about the inflation that is coming out, let alone the very bizarre threats from the Russian embassy here in Athens, and even from the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Mrs. Zakharova, who has come out to threaten the Greeks with retaliations if they don't behave, and if they don't comply with the historical prerogatives of Greek-Russian friendship. So here we are, but we are very determined. We sent even military aid to Ukraine, let alone humanitarian. It is something that is very close to us. The Ukrainian border is closer to our northern border than to Crete. We have thousands of ethnic Greeks under threat in Mariupol. The martyrdom of whom has moved every Greek, together with the martyrdom of the rest of the Ukrainian people. But there are more than 100,000 Ukrainian citizens of ethnic Greek descent in the wider area of Mariupol. So it is a conflict that is very close, very moving, and very, very upsetting to us here in the south. We are worried about some powers getting used to it and kind of forgetting. And United States is always, fascinating politics. We have to see and wait what happens in the midterm and then in 2024. So there are question marks about this cohesion and unity and forthcomingness of the Western alliance. But here we are today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dimitris. We have lively discussion going on the Q&A side, but let me ask a question to each of you at this point. Using the opportunity of having Mary here in this panel, I would like to really ask a historical question. Now, Putin's justification for his brutal attack on Ukraine rests on three ideas, basically. One are the loony fantasies about history of Russia and relations with her neighbors, ideas of Russian mir, and so on. The second idea are completely false accusations of the Ukrainian government to commit genocide against its own people. And the third idea are those grievances vis-a-vis the West, which you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. Now, no one knows more than you about what happened after the end of Cold War. Is there any credibility in what Putin is telling us? Is a reason that those complaints are, have some elements of truth in it. So, Mary.
Yeah, so let me preface this by saying that I was already on the record years ago as referring to Putin as a grim and murderous leader. So I have no sympathy for the Putin regime. I know there are many, I have many Russian friends who are horrified by what is happening. Many of them are trying to get out of Russia. So I have no sympathy for Putin. I need to make that clear. The big issue in the post-Cold War era was the status of Russia. And regardless of what we think of Putin, and to repeat, I think very little of him, that question remains, right? Russia is the largest country on earth by landmass. It is part of Europe. And in the post-Cold War era, there was no defined place for Russia in the European security order. Again, this is no question of doing this because we like the Putin regime. This is just a question of practicality. When you have one of the biggest military powers in the world in your geographic region, it's hard to proceed without a sustainable position for it. And so the post-Cold War era witnessed this tragic arc, which I describe in my book, Not 1 Inch, from the unexpected moment of deliverance from the thermonuclear conflict, represented by the success of the solidarity protest movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union subsequently, and the beginning of true cooperation between Washington and Moscow. As Moscow was democratizing and becoming a market economy, it also engaged in far-reaching nuclear disarmament together with Washington. That was, of course, the greatest moment of disarmament since the dawn of the atomic age. Now, this wasn't simply altruistic. Russia was trying to either destroy or somehow take possession of parts of the former Soviet nuclear arsenal that had landed outside its territory at the breakup moment of the Soviet Union. As many people on this call will know, because of that, Ukraine was born nuclear. Ukraine became the third largest nuclear power in the world immediately upon becoming independent because of the sheer amount of nuclear arsenal left over from the Soviet Union on its territory. Now, it's important to add that command and control of that arsenal was in Moscow, not in Kyiv. So the Ukrainians had physical possession of the weapons, but not command and control. But there was a lot of technological savvy in Ukraine. It had been the place where many Soviet missiles and planes had been built, and presumably with enough time and money, Ukraine could have basically taken command of those missiles. But Ukraine decided to give them up in exchange for economic aid, a decision that many Ukrainians are now regretting. It was a necessary one at the time because the Ukrainian economy was in free fall and it needed the support. But obviously now there are many questions about how would history be different if Ukraine had somehow held on to those weapons. So in other words, you had this moment at the end of the Cold War where you had this willingness to cooperate on democratization, on the spread of market economies, on nuclear disarmament, and then it falls apart in the course of the 1990s through a series of self-harming choices on Russia's part, particularly by Boris Yeltsin, the former Russian president, to begin a brutal, brutal war in Chechnya, which sadly now looks like a precursor to what's going on. You see a very corrupt process of privatization in Russia. So you have a series of self-harming choices in Russia, which I think are the most important factor in deteriorating relations. But you also have decisions on the West to basically avoid defining a place for Russia in the post-Cold War security order. And these are what I talk about in my book, Not 1 Inch. So there is this tragic arc in the 90s where this moment of cooperation was lost. The way I put it in the book is that Cold Wars are not short-lived affairs, so thaws are precious. And neither side made the best use of the thaw in the 1990s. And now, sadly, we are living with the consequences today. Now that Putin has made clear, now that Moscow is no longer silent, now that Putin has made clear that he's not happy with the fact that Russia had no acceptable birth defined for it. Now he's decided to force one with violence, which is truly, truly tragic.
Okay, great. Let me shift the gear a little bit and move to the current affairs. You know, we are in the fourth week of this tragic war, with thousands of innocent people being killed, cities destroyed, millions of refugees in neighboring countries, and every day West is buying energy from Russia, which is worth $450 million. So we are de facto financing Putin's war. Olaf Scholz today in the Bundestag said that energy ban would trigger recession, and there is big disagreement about this among business class in Germany. I wonder, Sigmar, Gabriel, what do you think about this? Can we afford the ban on energy? How the sanctions, if they go further, can affect European economy?
It would definitely affect the European, especially the German economy, but not only the German. Look to Bulgaria, they are dependent by 100% on Russian energy flows. You see what would happen in Italy. And the fear of, I would say, the majority of the political leaders in Europe, not the East Europeans, by the way, they are pushing hard to also sanctionize and to cut the gas and oil pipelines. But the majority are afraid that the consequences would hurt the European economy much more than it hurts Russia, or that European citizens would not be willing to suffer as much as Russian citizens are willing to do or used to do. And that at the end of the day, we would lose the social support for our sanctions against Russia. If people would become unemployed, if German economy would go down, by the way, then we would not be able to support other European member states, which will be necessary during the next months and years. I mean, we saw that after the pandemic, we fortunately had the agreement with the help of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel to this European Recovery Fund. I'm sure we will have a second one now, because if not, other economies in Europe would suffer much more than Germany would suffer. But if the Germany's economic engine would go down, it's maybe more in the interest of Putin than in the interest of the stability of the West. That's what the majority of the European governments think. But there's a big but. If Russia really would use, for example, biological or chemical weapons, or would use a tactical nuclear weapon, maybe not for a real mass destruction, but only to show that it is willing to use it, then of course it will change the situation dramatically. But then we have to be very honest, we will go into a deep recession in Europe. That will be the consequence. And of course, Germany and others, they try to get access to other energy suppliers. But if you ask, for example, the Qataris, they will tell you that they are only flexible by 10–15% of their gas production. They could double their size, but therefore they would need 2 or 3 years. So that's the reason why the majority of the European leaders are reluctant to this idea. But in the case of other events, this is also part of the answer. I mean, the big question is, what will Europe, together with the United States, do if Russia uses the next step? I mean, it's impossible not to answer. It's impossible. On the other hand, we want we don't want to escalate into a nuclear war. And then I would say the next step would be to cut off oil and gas. But then you need in Germany and some others a Winston Churchill speech about what's coming in a society which for decades lives in a very comfortable situation. To see how big the shift in Germany is between the speech of the German Chancellor 2 weeks ago and what happened before, you can go back. We had in the last autumn, we had our general elections. We had 300 minutes debates of journalists, media journalists, with the 3 candidates who wanted to be the next chancellor. Only 15 minutes they were asked about international affairs, only 15 minutes. And all 15 minutes, it was about Afghanistan, nothing more. So the Germans, through their economic success, we're the biggest winner of globalization. We only saw the rest of the world through the corner of our eyes. We did not put the global development in the center of our perspective. This is the real dramatic change in our country, not the speech of the chancellor, but the whole society is moving. And my hope is that they would be willing even to go the next step by sanctioning gas and oil if Putin wants to test our unity. But for the time being, the leaders are reluctant because of the backlash we would feel in Europe. By the way, much more than the US would feel it.
We have a number of questions and comments about China, and let me direct this to Dimitri because Greece was not all a great friend of Soviet Union and Russia in the past, but also is a great friend of China now, with a lot of Chinese investment coming through Greece to Europe. So what's the role of China? How dangerous may be if China takes really side of Russia in this conflict? Can you envision that they will be just sitting on the fence and doing by and large nothing, or they can really move and change the balance in not in favor of the West in this?
Yes, allow me just to underline the last phrase of Mr. Gabriel, that this issue of sanctioning the energy sector of Russia can potentially divide the West between Europe and America, in the sense that Europe is much more dependent compared to America, that imports very little from Russia, and this can become an issue of discord in the Western alliance, especially if the pressure continues and if there is escalation in Ukraine. Given the fact that we have decided not to intervene militarily, we are left with the sanction as the main weapon to counteract Russia's behavior. And since we have sanctioned most of the sectors, the one really big one left is the energy. There will be more talk on that side as the conflict continues to escalate and to deteriorate, I am afraid. The same goes for the one NATO member that has refused to put up sanctions against Russia, that being Turkey, creating a big loophole in the effectiveness of sanctioning Russia, since now most international flights, a lot of banking transactions and trade goes through Turkey, and therefore, while the Finns, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Germans pay the price of these sanctions, there is one country in the NATO alliance that makes a profit out of this dreadful situation. And it will be spotlighted more as the situation deteriorates, I'm afraid. Now, vis-a-vis China, and obviously a very interesting question is what India might do as the biggest democracy in this alliance, global alliances of democracies versus autocracies. It has refused to condemn Russia in the UN, and it's an interesting choice. But let's come to China. Now, China is obviously on a very first level a winner of this mess for a number of reasons, because it creates a problem in the West, in Europe, away from the Pacific and away from the anti-Chinese alliance that Biden formed back in September, the famous AUKUS with Australia and Britain. Obviously, the conflict brings Russia much closer to China for a number of reasons, economically and strategically. However, there are some caveats in this reasoning. First, China, I heard Mr. Gabriel saying with some bravado that Germany is the big beneficiary of the globalization. Obviously, this is true, but if there is one big beneficiary of globalization the last 30 years, this is undoubtedly China. Let me remind our audience that the Chinese and the Russian economies were of equal size 30 years ago. Today, China is 12 times the size of Russia's. It shows the extraordinary growth and the extraordinary benefits of China from globalization. So, whereas the jingoists in Beijing might be happy on a very first level with everything happening in Europe, they are also concerned on better thinking about undermining a global system out of which they benefited so much. And they managed to enrich China in an unprecedented pace, right? So China traditionally is against change of borders, against this kind of revisionism for a number of reasons that have to do with the internal situation inside China. So there is this caveat. Furthermore, Russia's pivoting towards China can only happen as a junior partner of China, not as an equal partner. There are a few million Russians in Siberia all the way to Vladivostok, facing hundreds of Chinese, well-fed and much richer than in the past. I mean, if you see that border, the balance of power is definitely on the Chinese side, right? So there are issues. There, but for sure, on a very primary strategic level, China is welcoming this alliance with Moscow and has refused even to talk about an invasion or a war in Ukraine. It keeps on using the Putin's terminology about a special military operation. The Chinese media have censored much of the reporting from Ukraine and so on and so forth.
Mary has intervention on the China question.
Just something briefly from a historian, specifically from my friend, Professor Arnie Westad of Yale, because Grzegorz, you asked me to talk about historical considerations. Arnie Westad has been making a point about China that I think is significant and bears repeating. China is obviously hugely important in this conflict. She is currently Putin's most important friend, and if she would put pressure on Putin to end this conflict, it might actually have an effect. And as Arnie Westad has pointed out, this would be in China's interest because there is a very unfortunate historical parallel here. and it is to the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was one power that was clearly going to dominate the coming century because its industry was rising, it had cutting edge technology, its military was increasing, and that country was Germany. And then Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm, made the tragic decision to support a crumbling empire on its border that wanted to attack a smaller neighbor, meaning, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in attacking Serbia. And that led to World War I and dragged Germany down into the abyss. And instead of dominating the 20th century, Germany was ruined, and the 20th century was dominated by the United States. So I know that in Beijing, they're very conscious of history, and I think they should be conscious of this parallel and not make the same choice now about supporting a crumbling neighbor next door. It is not in their interest. And so I hope that American diplomats are making that clear to China as a way of making it clear that China should change its position and help to end this terrible violence, because the results could be unpredictable for China as well as for the rest of the world.
Sigmar, please.
I agree that China did not decide how to behave, because on the one hand side, for them, it's to get Russia, it's a low-hanging fruit for them. There is an old rivalry between China and Russia, and to get Russia so cheap, there are some parts of the Chinese leadership which would say that's in our interest, because to have no conflicts with Russia on one side means that China could also concentrate on their maritime interests in the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand side, they are happy that the US again has to be engaged in Europe, because they do not concentrate their own power to the Indo-Pacific. So that's the one side. The other side is, what's the biggest interest of a Chinese leader? To show his citizens that every year they become a bit richer, a bit more closer to social security, and friction in the world trade, a disruption in the global economy. That's not in the interest of Chinese leadership. They are not interested in having skyrocketing energy prices. So that's the other side of the coin, and they don't want to come close to be not to respect US sanctions, because they don't want to be part of the war or by secondary sanctions from the US. So there is a struggle inside China, and I would say as long as they do not see a real chance to step up as a kind of mediator, they will only have rhetorical speeches about peace. If they would see a chance to be the mediator of a ceasefire or a peace process or settlement, then of course they would step up, because it would be the biggest thing of Chinese foreign policy since the founding of the People's Republic of China. So they would try to do this, but as long as they do not see that Putin is willing to negotiate, they will only have rhetorical speeches and stay on the sidelines, looking what's happening on the ground. But I would agree that there are two sides in China which are struggling. The one which is happy to get this fruit very cheap, and the others who are maybe on the long-term interest don't want to come into economic troubles, because China first become old before it becomes rich and strong. And that's the challenge where they are heading in the next years.
Thank you. I'm very sorry to say that unfortunately we reached our time limit, and our guests have other engagements, so we cannot really go on with the panel. As you all have seen, we just only scratched the surface of all the important questions and problems which we are facing because of that completely unbelievable and brutal invasion of Ukraine. We will be back with another events in this series, and let me thank so much to Mary Sarotte, Sigmar, Gabriel, and Dimitris Keridis for participating in this panel. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us for the discussion.